So today we'll start with the subject diencephalon. So diencephalon is a part of the forebrain and it comprises of the thalamus, the hypothalamus. Along with that, there are two other components which have not been written here. I'll be telling you the subthalamus, metathalamus and the epithalamus. The cavity of the diencephalon is the third ventricle. So you can see we'll just start off with this. So now look at this picture. What do you see? This picture is the medial surface of the brain. The medial surface of the brain, you can see. Now I'm just putting my cursor in front. This part is the frontal pole and this is the occipital pole. That means this is the anterior side and this is the posterior side with the cerebellum inferior. This is the brainstem, cut edge of the brainstem, the pons protruding ahead, the medulla, and this is the midbrain with the colliculi. So the cavity of the midbrain is the cerebral aqueduct of the fourth ventricle in the hindbrain between pons, medulla, and cerebellum, and between the diencephalon. Two sides, there's a slit-like cavity which is called the third ventricle. Now we have to get acquainted to certain structures which are present on the medial surface of the brain. To understand the connections and the way they work and the circuits, it is imperative to understand the fiber bundles. So the bundle out here that you see, this white matter bundle is called the corpus callosum. Anteriorly, this thin end is called the rostrum. The bend is called the genu. The portion above the lateral ventricle that you see is called the body, and the terminal posterior end is called the splenium. You can see another bundle of fiber out here, that's the fornix. Look at this cavity out here. This is the lateral ventricle. The ventricle which is present, that's the fluid-filled cavity with CSF present in the cerebral hemisphere, is called the lateral ventricle. And we can see certain bulges out here. This is the part of the basal ganglia, the caudate nucleus. This is the fornix. And what do you see out here? This structure that you see out here is called the thalamus, an egg-shaped structure. This is the thalamus, so part of the diencephalon. Let's now come into see what is this. I said this is the rostrum, the genu. If we bring this below the thalamus, this area that one sees is called the hypothalamus. Now see this structure. This is the optic chiasma where the optic nerves are crossing over, forming the optic chiasma, and they will continue as the optic tracts. A swollen area out here anteriorly, that's called the mammillary body. The mammillary body. Posteriorly, we have the pineal gland, and there is another commissure out here which is called the posterior commissure. So the pineal gland, the posterior commissure, there is a nuclei here called the habenular nuclei, and this portion is called the hypothalamus. The portion above is called the thalamus. Both of them are separated by a sulcus which is called the hypothalamic sulcus. I'll show you in a better picture later on. So there are two thalamus on either side of the cerebral hemisphere and this connected with each other by a small gray matter which is called the interthalamic adhesions. Now let's come to the next picture. So I'm just trying to acquaint you with this picture so that you understand what are these. When we ask you label these or identify these structures, when we'll be showing you in the brain, you will be able to tell us what they are. Now let's come here. So the diencephalon, what do we understand? It is divided into a dorsal thalamus and a ventral thalamus, which is the subthalamus and the hypothalamus. Now let's look at this. This is the thalamus. Look at this gray elevation that you see. This is the interthalamic adhesion. Posteriorly, I told you there is a small gland which is called the pineal gland with two commissures by which it is hanging from the brain. It's hanging by two stalks, pineal stalks. One is a posterior stalk called the posterior commissure, and anteriorly this commissure is called the habenular commissure, connecting it to the habenular nuclei. That means this component that is present out here is called the epithalamus. This is thalamus, this is epithalamus. Can you see there is a blue line which is been drawn out here? This is the thalamus. Below the blue line, this is called the thalamic sulcus, and this would be continuing down with the aqueduct. That's the cavity for the midbrain, and the area which is behind this or below this is called the hypothalamus. This is the hypothalamus. This area that you see is the sella turcica. Just all of you identify this. This is the sella turcica. This is the hypophysis. That's the pituitary gland connected by the infundibulum. So infundibulum, this elevation out here is called the median eminence, and the area is called the tuber cinereum. I'll be showing you all this later. The posterior part of the thalamus out here, it's not visible because of the pineal gland. I'll show you a better picture. There is the pulvinar with the median and lateral geniculate body, which is called the metathalamus. Between thalamus and the midbrain, there is a small area of gray matter which is called the subthalamus. Just below the thalamus is called the subthalamus. Now let's see what it is. So as you can see, this area is the thalamus. Below the hypothalamic sulcus is the hypothalamus. The cavity of this is called the third ventricle, and this is the lateral ventricle. Now we draw a line. This structure that you see out here is actually the optic chiasma. This is the anterior commissure. Anterior commissure, the optic chiasma. If we draw a line from the optic chiasma to the interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen is a foramen which is communicating between the two lateral ventricles and also communicating with the third ventricle. That means it's an opening because the other side of the cerebral hemisphere is going to come and oppose it. So we have a communication between the two ventricles and a communication between the third ventricle, which is called the interventricular foramen. So this line that we draw is a line demarcating the forebrain, that's the telencephalon from the diencephalon or thalamus, and a line from the mammillary body to the pineal stalk is separating the diencephalon from the midbrain. So this area that we see between these two red lines and this upper line, if I say this is the fornix, so the area between these two lines below the fornix is the diencephalon area, right? So now let's come. So this is what it looks like when we have a dissected brain. The cavity you can make out when the part of the corpus callosum and cerebral hemisphere has been removed. You can see this cavity. You can appreciate the cavity. You can look at the thalamus, and this is the thalamus. This is the interthalamic sulcus. So this cavity would be the third ventricle, and this would be the cerebral aqueduct, and this would be the fourth ventricle. So this area, so again I'm just showing you in different pictures, and can you see these structures that you see out here? This is the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus, blood vessels with pia mater, and ependyma, which are responsible for secreting the CSF. These are vascular structures which are lying in them, like plexuses. So they call choroid plexus will be like frills. You will be seeing them tomorrow when we show you the brains. We'll be showing you the choroid plexus. Now let's look at the thalamus as it looks. So here the brain has been separated out just to show you the thalamus. So now first of all, whenever we see this, we have to see which is the anterior part and which is the posterior part. So from corpus callosum you can make out, look at the dilated posterior swelling, that's the splenium. Anterior part has a bend. So you know that this is the anterior part and this is the posterior part. The thalamus looks like an egg. Anterior end is narrow while posterior end is rounded. This is called the pulvinar area. It has a superior surface, it has a medial surface, and it has an inferior surface, and it also has a lateral surface which would be coming against the lateral ventricle. So now let's come and see this. So the thalamus forms the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So I hope you understand that the third ventricle is a slit-like cavity between the two thalami. So the lateral wall is formed by the thalamus. Separated from the hypothalamus is a thin sulcus which is called the hypothalamic sulcus. The hypothalamic sulcus, and it is connected to the opposite side by this small mass of gray matter called the interthalamic adhesions. Now look at this. This is what it looks like, the third ventricle. Now if you look at this, this is what it looks like. This is the cavity of the third ventricle, which has medial wall. The lateral wall of the third ventricle is formed by the medial side of both the thalami. The roof is formed by ependyma hanging from the center. On either side, there is ependyma with choroid plexus, which is hanging. That forms the roof of the third ventricle. That forms the roof. Out here, if you see more superiorly, these are the part of the lateral ventricle, and this will be the point which we will call as the interventricular foramen. That means the thalamus is forming the roof and further is forming the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and if we go more laterally, it is forming the floor of the lateral ventricle. So this is the lateral ventricle, it's forming the floor of the lateral ventricle and the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Look at this. Just below the thalamus, can you see a small biconvex disc-like structure? That is the subthalamus. That is the subthalamus, which is a part which gives connections to the basal ganglia. So it is a part of the extrapyramidal pathway. So here you can see the interventricular. So the anterior end of the thalamus lies just behind the anterior interventricular foramen, and the caudal part lies just above the superior colliculus in front of the pineal body. So this is the caudal end of the interventricular. So that is the extent of this third ventricle. So the floor would be continuous with the cerebral aqueduct. And below this, all that we see is part of the hypothalamus. This is the subthalamus. Rest of these structures that we see are part of the hypothalamus. So we will now try to see what are the surfaces and boundaries of this thalamus. So it is bounded laterally by the caudate nucleus. So we have here the superior surface of the thalamus. This is the thalamus, the superior surface of the thalamus. Now just look at this. It is forming the floor of the lateral ventricle. But if we go more laterally, what do you see? You see on the superior surface, there is a small nucleus out here. There is a small nucleus out here, which is called the caudate nucleus. So the thalamus and the caudate nucleus, in between these two, there are two structures which are very important. One is called the thalamus striate vein, and there is a nerve tract which is called the stria terminalis. That means there are two important structures lying between the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Right? Thalamus striate vein and stria terminalis. For the time being, just remember these two names. Stria terminalis is a pathway. It's a connecting pathway. We will be discussing that later. That's between the habenular nucleus, and the lateral part lies in the floor of the lateral ventricle covered by ependyma. Medial part is related to choroid plexus of the third ventricle, because that is the one which is coming and forming the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So it has choroid plexus out here, right? The striatum medullaris thalami is a fascicular nerve fibers courses along its dorsomedial margin and below is limited by the hypothalamic sulcus, forms the upper part, or we say wall, of the third ventricle. So the stria medullaris thalami, this is the stria medullaris thalami, is a fascicle coming from the habenula and going to the hypothalamus. So this is called the stria terminalis from the amygdala to the habenula. We'll not go into the details of where it is, and this is forming it's crossing it between the thalamus and the caudate nucleus, forms the upper part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and all of this is covered by ependyma. Lateral surface is related to, this is the thalamus. Now try to orient yourself. Now let's try to orient to this structure. The structure out there here, this part is the corpus callosum. This is a coronal section. This is a part of the septum pellucidum. This is the septum pellucidum is a membrane which is a curtain-like structure coming between the two lateral ventricles. From here, this is the interventricular foramen where the communication between the two ventricles happen with the third ventricle. This is choroid plexus from the surface of the thalamus hanging down. Laterally, this is the thalamus. If you see, there is a bundle of white matter out here between the caudate and the thalamus. This is called internal capsule. Internal capsule is a bundle of white matter. In the next lecture of cerebrum, where we will be doing fibers of white matter, we will be telling you about the internal capsule, external capsule, and about the corpus callosum. Different kinds of fibers we will be discussing. Inferior surface of the thalamus rests on the hypothalamus and the subthalamic nuclei. Subthalamus. So this is the boundary of the thalamus. So superiorly, it is related to the lateral ventricle, forming its floor and the caudate nucleus. Inferiorly, between the hypothalamus and subthalamus. Medially, it is related to the third ventricle. Laterally, it's related to the internal capsule. Please try to remember these. We will be showing you these sections also. This gives you a better idea of the third ventricle, the corpus callosum, and if you look at this, this is cerebellum. These are the colliculi, superior and inferior colliculi. This is the third ventricle, slit-like structure. So this that you see out here, these two structures that you see is actually the thalamus. And this posterior portion of the thalamus, which is swollen up, is called the pulvinar. So this is in a brain. That was a diagrammatic representation out here. So you can make out that this slit-like structure is the third ventricle, and the thalamus, the dorsal surface. The surface that we see is the dorsal surface. So now again, it's much clearer here. Look at this. This structure is the thalamus. This is the caudate nucleus. This bundle of white matter that we see out here is a part of the external capsule, internal capsule. This is internal capsule, and outside this is called the external capsule. We'll do that later. Here you see that we have a much thicker portion. So this is the interventricular foramen. This is the fornix, and this is the corpus callosum. Now the thalamus, as I said, it is an egg-shaped structure. The anterior part is slightly narrower. The posterior part is swollen. The thalamus is covered by a thin sheet of white matter, which is called the stratum juvenile. Laterally, it has a lamina, which is called the external medullary lamina on the medial surface. The thalamus itself, this egg-like structure, is divided into, it's nothing but a condensed group of nuclei, giving the shape of an egg-shaped structure in the cerebrum. And this is divided into smaller groups of nuclei by a Y-shaped white matter fiber, which is called as the internal medullary lamina. So between the Y, this area that you see is called the anterior group of nucleus. On either side of the medial part of the stem of the Y is the medial group of the nucleus, and where lateral to the stem is the lateral group of the nucleus. The posterior group is swollen up, it calls the pulvinar, and the part of this which is ventral anterior is called the ventral group of nucleus, and this portion which is more laterally is called the lateral group of nucleus. So let's just remember one thing, that the Y-shaped lamina divides the thalamus into three groups: an anterior group, a medial group, and a lateral group. The lateral group has two tires, a ventral tire and a dorsal tire. So these are the ventral tire and this is the dorsal tire. On the surface, this is on the ventral surface. So now let's come to this. So the dorsal tire nuclei are called lateral dorsal and lateral posterior and pulvinar. Lateral dorsal, lateral posterior and pulvinar. The ventral one is called ventro-anterior, ventrolateral, ventro-posterior, which has been divided into ventro-posterolateral and ventro-posteromedial. It might find very confusing of remembering these terms now, but now for your simple understanding, remember anterior group, medial group, lateral group. Lateral group has a dorsal tire and a ventral tire. Ventral tire has anterior, lateral, and an intermediate group, anterior, lateral, intermediate, and posterior group. Posterior group has a ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedial. Now let's come to this. The anterior group of nucleus. This is the anterior group of nucleus. It receives fibers from the mammillary body by a tract which is called the mammillothalamic tract, part of the limbic system. And from here it will go to the cingulate gyrus. You remember, now just try to remember the corpus callosum that we have seen. Just above the corpus callosum, the gyrus is called the cingulate gyrus. This is associated with emotions and recent memory. Each of these fiber bundles that we are talking about have certain functions. So this is for emotions and recent memory, part of the limbic system. This is the medial surface, this is the corpus callosum, this is the cingulate gyrus. Remember this. This is the cingulate gyrus. So look at this, light gray. This is this, and it has reciprocal connections. So comes from the mammillary body to the enterothalamic nucleus and then goes to the cingulate gyrus. So mammillothalamic. Now the medial dorsal, two-way connections with the prefrontal and frontal lobe, the medial group to the prefrontal frontal lobe, that's the motor cortex, and hypothalamic nuclei, that is below the thalamus, integration of large sensory information, that is somatic, visceral, olfactory, in relation to emotional feelings. So there is an integration of our sensations like somatic sensations, visceral sensations, olfactory sensations to the emotions related to them. You smell something nice, you eat some good food, these are all sensory stimuli. These give us some kind of memory, some kind of feelings. They can be pleasurable feelings, they may not be pleasurable, unpleasant feelings. They can give rise to certain memories in us. So that is what these nuclei are doing. While the lateral group of nuclei, the lateral dorsal and lateral posterior with pulvinar, they connect the thalamic nuclei with cerebrum, parietal, temporal, and cingulate occipital cord. They are part with the cerebral, while the ventral tired nuclei with the anterior reticular formation, substantia nigra. So that is with the extrapyramidal pathway with the corpus striatum, that's basal ganglia, the substantia nigra, and influencing the premotor cortex. Influences the motor cortex. The ventral lateral major part comes from the cerebellum and output again goes to the cortex. So if you remember, we did dentitothalamic pathways. They come from the red nucleus, go to the dentate, rubral, thalamic, and from there they go to the cerebrum. From there they come to as the corticopontine cerebellar fibers to influence the cerebellum, and then they will also go down to the motor cortex, to the spinal cord. So it is the one which is influencing the cerebellum. While the ventroposteromedial is ascending trigeminal and gustatory pathway, and all of you, if you remember, the ventroposterolateral we've been doing is where the medial and spinal lemniscus terminate. That's the third order neuron, and the thalamocortical projections will go to the sensory cortex. So the ventroposterior is the sensory inputs coming from the ventroposteromedial by the trigeminal spine. Trigeminal lemniscus, and gustatory coming from the solitary nucleus, and ventroposterolateral by the medial and spinal lemniscus, which you remember carrying sensations from the body, peripheral sensations of pain, touch, pressure, temperature, position senses by the and vibration by the posterior column. They are all coming by the medial lemniscus and spinal lemniscus. These are the intralaminar nuclei. There are some reticular nuclei which influence the consciousness and alertness. So reticular formation is usually for consciousness and alertness to that we call as the wakefulness. And these midline nuclei also have reticular connections between the lamina. So the intralaminar nuclei are embedded within the intralaminar medullary lamina, which are centromedial, medial lateral geniculate, which are described under metathalamus, and the reticular nucleus, earlier described as part of the dorsal thalamus, is now regarded as part of the ventral thalamus. Anyway, you don't have to remember all this, but this is the master chart for all these connections. If you remember that the cerebellum is going to the ventral intermediate part of the nucleus, while the sensory pathways, that is the sensory pathways, if we see the medial lemniscus, the spinal lemniscus, the trigeminal lemniscus, and taste will all come to the ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedial. The hearing and vision, hearing to the medial geniculate, vision to the lateral geniculate. And from there they will go to the respective cortex. The anterior group of nucleus from the limbic system, mammillary body coming to the anterior group of nucleus, and then reciprocal connections to the cingulate gyrus. So indirectly, all sensations to the thalamus are interpreted. They are coming to the thalamus, excepting the olfactory nucleus, which doesn't have a direct connection. It comes, or we say, through the amygdaloid complex, but it doesn't get interpreted here. It helps in our recent memory and our emotional expressions, but it doesn't have, like these systems are all having the third order neuron here, and final termination is in the cerebral cortex. This gets processed in the olfactory lobe, amygdala, and then comes here for our emotional behaviors. And then we have on through the dorsal tire, we have the basal ganglia. This putamen and globuses are part of the basal ganglia. So this is what it shows, how these nuclei are there. This is the olivary and the basal ganglia to the ventral group out here. The ventral posterior, lateral and medial having the medial lemniscus, lateral lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus. The two pathways out here, the auditory and visual to the medial and lateral geniculate pathways. So we can see how all the sensations that go to the cerebral cortex are all actually relayed in the thalamus. So thalamus has a capacity to actually interpret some of these to all the sensations, but the final sensations like two-point discrimination, stereognosis, like identifying an object, to feel the texture, that's done in the cerebral cortex, but the touch, pain, temperature is felt out here, which is one of the primary basic sensory sensations which are received here or perceived here. But the final interpretation in human beings takes place in the sensory cortex in the cerebral hemisphere. So this shows you a picture of the areas of the all the nuclei group. As you can see how they have been color coded, and each color code has a particular part of the cerebral hemisphere. Now just give an example of the anterior nucleus. It's yellow. The cingulate gyrus out here is yellow. Now let's look at this. This we say the medial geniculate body is the auditory pathway, light purple, and here it is. This is the superior temporal gyrus, the auditory pathway. The lateral, light blue, this is the auditory cortex. All these, so each one, so this is the central sulcus. In front of the central sulcus is the motor area. Post central sulcus is the sensory area. So accordingly, every part has its own connections. So anteriorthalamic nucleus is mammillary body of hypothalamus via mammillothalamic tract, and anterior limbic area, cingulate gyrus, parapupal gyrus. There the afferents come from here and efferents go to this. That is to the cingulate gyrus. When we do limbic system, this is going to become much clearer with you. And functionally part of the limbic system involved in control of alertness and attention and acquisition of memory, recent memory. So this is what the anteriorthalamic nucleus is doing. Connection of the ventral anterior nucleus. The ventral anterior nucleus is this part. This is the anterior, sorry. Where's my cursor? So this is the anterior, this is the ventral anterior. It is connecting, getting fibers from the globus pallidus, substantia nigra, premotor cortex, and the frontal eye field, and giving its input to the premotor and motor area, that is in the cerebral cortex. Influences motor activity. So ventral anterior nuclei are influencing motor activity. This is summing up of what we did. So remember, ventro-anterior, if you don't remember anything, you can always say they are influencing the motor activity. Connection of ventroposterolateral and ventroposterolateral medial, all sensations are received by this, by spinal lemniscus, medial lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, and the taste fibers by the solitary thalamic tract, and getting interpreted out here in the cerebral cortex. I hope you people are understanding what I'm saying, because these are connections that we are doing which can be a bit challenging, and it might feel that ma'am itni jaldi bol rahe, hame samajh nahi aa raha, we are not able to understand what she's saying. But don't worry, I am doing the main connections with you. So remember only that. So ventroposterolateral, ventroposteromedian, we've done these ascending tracts. Remember, all the sensory tracts are coming here, going to cerebral cortex sensory area, right? Connection of ventrolateral nucleus, anterior, middle, and posterior part. So they will be going to premotor area. बस इतना ही याद करो. ये थोड़ी सी है nucleus which have got not very clear about them. It is said that they are connected with this the basal ganglia, midbrain, the substantia nigra, and the cerebellum, which will be going to the premotor, or we say motor supplementary area. These are the ventrolateral nucleus, and connection of the lateral dorsal. That means we said that the thalamus, let's just revise, has 3 group of nucleus: an anterior group, a medial group, and a lateral group. Lateral group is lateral dorsal and lateral posterior. Just remember this. I'm not going to talk too much of detail about this. They are still under exploration about this, and they are part of the limbic system and integration of all the sensations. So anterior nucleus of the thalamus, this is the ventro-anterior. So this is also, as I have already said, that this is something very important that you should remember. This is part of the mammillothalamic tract. Medial dorsal, medial integrates emotion, thoughts, and judgment. The medial dorsal and medial dorsal group, integration of emotion, thought, and judgment. So they are the medial dorsal nucleus and the nucleus reunions. They are connecting, getting fibers from the hypothalamus, amygdala, other thalamic nuclei, and prefrontal cortex, and giving reciprocal connections to the prefrontal area. So this also is something you can remember. And I'm not going to go much onto the reticular formation, because reticular formation is getting nucleus from the thalamocortical, corticothalamic, thalamus striatum, and pallidothalamic tract, inhibitory modulation of thalamocortical transmissions. So it causes inhibition of all the thalamocortical pathways which are going from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, while the medial geniculate body is for the auditory pathway, so receiving from the inferior colliculus to the medial geniculate body by a brachium which is called the inferior brachium, and from here it will go to the auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex, responsible for hearing. Similarly, lateral geniculate body coming from the superior colliculus, ipsilateral hemiretina, that is the way it is carrying fibers from ipsilateral hemiretina and contralateral hemiretina, that is because at the optic chiasma there is crossing over, and by the superior brachium goes to the primary visual area, which is area 17. This is just a flow chart. It's from the Snell's Neuroanatomy. You can all go through it, or if you want, we'll just give you a printout of this so that you can all just revise the nuclear groups, or we can share few of these connections with you which are important in the class. That I'll see to it that we do that so that you can remember. So the inferior surface of the brain that we see here, this is the optic nerve, this is the optic nerve, this is the optic chiasma, these are the optic tracts. Optic nerve, this is optic tract, this is the anterior perforated substance, these are the swellings are the mammillary body, this is called the median eminence, and this is the base of the pituitary stalk. If there is a it's called the infundibulum, and then you have the hypophysis with it. So this, all this area is actually part of the hypothalamus, this area. So hypothalamus is nuclear groups below the thalamus which are lying adjacent to the third ventricle. It has a medial zone of group of nuclei and a lateral group of nuclei. It's going to be too much if I start describing the names. And some of these nuclei also have a medial and lateral, like we can see the preoptic and preoptic are both on both the sides. The suprachiasmatic also is a bigger nucleus, it's on both the sides. So just remember that there are two sets of nucleus, the medial and the lateral, and they are the ones which are integrating all our autonomic functions. So we have visceral afferents from the whole body which are coming to the hypothalamus, and efferents which will be going to the brainstem, to the mammillary body, from that to the thalamus, and to the midbrain and limbic system. So this is a part which is responsible. Most of it is done in physiology, because you'll be doing about the supraoptic nucleus, the paraventricular nucleus, of their hormonal secretions and all that in physiology. So here we just tell you that these nucleus, where they are situated, and their function is just control of autonomic functions. So when we talk about the thalamus, sensory, all sensory information except this is for the thalamus is related in the cerebral cortex via the thalamus, and the motor system outputs from the basal ganglia and cerebellum are also relayed by the thalamus. It is responsible for the emotional and memory circuit, which is called the Papith circuit, helps to control some emotional and memory information which goes to the limbic system. Thalamic syndrome. A vascular lesion in the thalamus leads to this, and the threshold for pain and temperature is decreased on the opposite side. Emotional instability, spontaneous laughing and crying happens. And this is again another condition which is the thalamic had. We will be discussing it when we will be doing the thalamus in your practicals. We will be doing more of some lesions, and I will be discussing all this in detail with you as much as required, because so much of detail is actually not required for undergraduates. For PGs, yes, for postgraduates, but we will be studying them. So contra hand, lateral hand, if it's the left side, the right hand will be in an abnormal posture in thalamic syndrome patient. Wrist will be pronated and flexed, metacarpophalangeal flexed, and there will be extension of the interphalangeal joints, and they can be moved. So with that, I finished the lecture of thalamus, and those who could attend, it's good. Those who have not attended, if possible, then we can probably relay tomorrow, because I see that there are 190 students who are attending this class. But anyway, tomorrow, so welcome you back, and we see you tomorrow. So that's for today.